and sacrificing animals every day is a bloody mess. Literally, I don't sound like an English person when I say that, but it was a bloody mess. Blood was everywhere, and so you had to have a lot of water to wash off, and the priests, no doubt, would get that blood on them. They had to wash their hands and everything to stay clean. So what else am I looking at? So that's the dimensions. You see the size. By today's standards, it's not particularly a ginormous building, if I can use that word. But in the ancient world, it was a sizable building. Not as sizable as his palace, mind you, which dwarfed the temple, but we'll get to that in the next chapter. And then over here on the right, you'll see the altar, which also was a very large structure in and of itself where the sacrifices took place. Any comments or questions about this picture? Yes? Yes, so the horns on the altar. Now this altar is big enough to where you can only grab one horn. But yes, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think the Mormons copied that, the seed.
Oh, the Mormons,
Baptism by proxy.
Oh, yes, the basin. And I think tonight we'll read about those calves or those bulls that are under it as a part of the visual of it. And then there was something else. When you said Mormons, it made me think of something. Oh, if you ever look at a Masonic lodge, which is not the temple, but they build those lodges or Masonic temples, I think they're called, very, very similar style of architecture as what you might have seen back then, and very geometric type patterns and that sort of thing, large stones and that sort of thing. All right. Anybody else before we move on? And we'll continue to describe, and I'll give you some opportunity for input in just a minute again. So we're in verse 17. The main hall in front of this room was 40 cubits long. The inside of the temple was cedar, carved with gourds and open flowers. Everything was cedar. No stone was to be seen. He prepared the inner sanctuary within the temple to set the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord there. Now, let me stop right there just a second. Did you catch that? Everything inside the temple was cedar, so that no stone was seen. Now, that may not sound like a lot to you and me, but in the ancient world, houses were all built with stone. They weren't typically wood structures. Wood was too scarce and too expensive, and they did not have the ability to mill it like we do now with blades that fine. It was mostly it was mostly stone. You just see stone everywhere. If you go to an archaeological site or an archaeological dig, you'll see all of the walls of all the houses are just stone. Now, on the stone, if they had the money, they would put a plaster over it that would make it flat. In the poor houses, they couldn't afford that. So, but you didn't see wood, and so when it says that everything was in wood, that was the best. That was the best of the best. Verse 19. Where's I invite 19 or 20? Okay. He prepared the inner sanctuary within the temple to set the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord there. The inner sanctuary was 20 cubits long, 20 wide, and this is the Holy of Holies, 20 long, 20 wide, and 20 high. He overlaid the inside with pure gold, and he also overlaid the altar of cedar. Solomon covered the inside of the temple with pure gold, and he extended gold chains across the front of the inner sanctuary, which was overlaid with gold. So he overlaid the whole interior with gold. He also overlaid with gold the altar that belonged to the inner sanctuary. In the inner sanctuary, he made a pair of cherubim of olive wood, which each 10 cubits high, One wing of the first cherub was 5 cubits long, and the other wing 5 cubits, 10 cubits from wingtip to wingtip. The second cherub also measured 10 cubits, for the 2 cherubim were identical in size and shape. The height of each cherub was 10 cubits. He placed the cherubim inside the innermost room of the temple, that is the Holy of Holies, with their wings spread out. The wing of one cherub touched one wall, while the wing of the other touched the other wall, and their wings touched each other in the middle of the room. He overlaid the cherubim with gold. I looked at a number of renderings of this and found some fantastical depictions, some bordered on the absurd, because it's open to interpretation as to what these cherubim actually looked like. What we do know is they were obviously large enough for one wing to touch each wall from side to side all the way across the temple. All right, go to another picture. I looked at so many pictures, I can't remember which ones I put here. Can you turn the lights, the spotlights off, or the fluorescents off for just a second so they can see this? Yeah, flip those. Yeah. That helps a little bit. So, sorry the picture is so dark. This is a computer-generated rendering. You see the Ark of the Covenant in here. And whoever did this had some sort of philosophical belief that these cherubim looked extraordinarily Egyptian. Or I've done a little bit of 3D rendering enough to know that it's more likely that these were objects included in his software program, and he just enlarged them instead of coming up with his own. But you do see the size and scale. Whatever it was pretty large, because you see these wings touching in the middle and touching on the walls on the right and left-hand side. All right, I think I've got 2 more pictures. Yeah, here's a close-up of the picture that I showed you a while ago. And again, we're guessing as to exactly what they look like, and so anybody's guess is probably as good as another. But what I do like about this, again, is that it shows the fact that it's just gold on gold on gold on gold, and that's a lot of gold. All right, next one. Is there another one? Yeah, so we'll leave it on this one. I like this. This is a little bit more from a person's eye view, maybe 8 or 10 feet off the ground, but it does give you an idea of the scale of the temple and of the altar and of the basin here, or the sea. And so we'll just leave it there. All right. Where was I? Verse 29. On the walls around the temple, in both, did I say that already? On the walls around the temple, in both the inner and outer rooms, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He also covered the floors of both the inner and outer rooms of the temple with gold. For the entrance of the inner sanctuary, he made doors of olive wood with 5-sided jambs. And on the 2 olive wood doors, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers, and overlaid the cherubim with palm trees with beaten gold. In the same way, he made 4-sided jambs of olive wood for the entrance to the main hall. He also made 2 pine doors, each having 2 leaves that turned in sockets. He carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers on them, and overlaid them with gold hammered evenly over the carvings. And he built the inner courtyard of 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams. The foundation of the temple of the Lord was laid in the 4th year, in the month of Ziv, in the 11th year, in the month of Bul, the 8th month. The temple was finished in all of its details according to its specifications. He had spent 7 years building it. Now, what's interesting, I know why they don't do this, but I would love it if they were to build a life-size replica in Israel somewhere, just so that we could get a visual of what they think it looked like. I would love to see a life-size replica of Solomon's temple, Zerubbabel's temple, and Herod's temple, so that we could see them in a massive place side by side. They won't do it, and I've not asked them why, but I suspect I already know why they have done this. There is a tabernacle that's out in the wilderness that for tourists to come and look at, but no temple. And the reason is, of course, they do want to build the temple, but they don't want to build it somewhere else for the tourists. They want to build the real temple on the Temple Mount, which they can't do. And so they don't have that. But I would love to see a life-size rendering. If you go to Nashville today, you can go to a complete, perfect, life-size reconstruction of the Parthenon, which is on the Acropolis, on the hill in Athens. Now, the Parthenon is quite a structure, and I've been to Athens. I've been on that Parthenon a couple times. It's an amazing wonder of the world, but you have to use your imagination a lot because most of it's missing, or a lot of it is missing. But you don't have to use your imagination in Nashville because that building's brand new. It's perfect. And it is an amazing structure. I would love to see this with the temple somewhere, but again, how can you do it without making somebody mad? And so we don't have a temple. Okay, all right, enough of that. Again, just leaving it there. When the basic building was completed, the workers focused on the inside of the temple, and I'm reading a commentary here, which was the most important part, for it was there that the priests carried out the ministry of the Lord. The interior walls from ceiling to floor were paneled in cedar boards overlaid with gold, on which were carved open flowers and gourds, and the floor was covered with planks of pine or fir, also overlaid with gold. A pair of beautifully carved folding doors led into the holy place from the court of the priests. Like the cherubim, these doors were made of olive wood, covered with gold, and they even had hinges of gold. Golden chains hung across the outside of the doors. Go back to that first picture. I don't know if they showed, I'm sorry, go to the third picture. Oh, no, that's the third one? All right, the only one you haven't shown. There. Now, I do like this because it shows the palm trees and the cherubim that were carved into the walls before it was plated with gold. I don't care what century you're in, this was a magnificent structure. So, the Ark of the Covenant, as you know, represented the throne of God and was enthroned between the cherubim. It was a wooden chest, 45 inches long, 27 inches wide, and 27 inches high, which is not a large box. Because the two tables of the law were in the ark, it was also called the Ark of the Testimony. Across from the top of the ark was a golden mercy seat, or across the top was a golden mercy seat, and each end was a cherub made of olive wood and covered with gold, and their wings formed somehow visually what would be considered a seat to symbolize the throne of God. It's so blurry in that picture, though, you can't even see that hardly on the ark. They just look like little bumps, but you've seen pictures or renderings of the ark before. Once a year, the high priest was permitted to enter the Holy of Holies, sprinkle the blood of the sacrifice on the mercy seat, and thus cover the sins of the people for another year. And so, as magnificent as that Holy of Holies was, you only had typically one person per generation that ever saw it, and that was the high priest. So nobody ever got to see it. I guess they were just left up to the high priest to describe it to them, because he was the only one that would ever go in there, as well as the rest of the temple was off limits to anybody else as well. Okay, by the way, when he went in there, I know I've told you this before, they would tie a rope around the guy so that if he had a heart attack and died in there, they wouldn't go get him, they just drag his body out. And so it was really serious, dead serious, literally, that nobody goes in there but the high priest. All right. Any comments or questions about what we've seen so far before we move on to chapter 7? Okay, now he's going to depart from this for just a little bit to talk about the palace, and then we'll get back to the temple again. 1 Kings chapter 7, verse 1. It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. How long did it take for the temple? 7. It took almost twice as long for the palace. And again, the palace was a much more expansive structure and probably far more ornate as well. Verse 2, he built the palace of the forest of Lebanon. It's actually called the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon because it has so many trees, so much pine from the Forest of Lebanon in it. It wasn't an official title, or it is here actually. He built the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon, 100 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 high, with 4 rows of cedar columns supporting trimmed cedar beams. It was roofed with cedar above the beams that rested on the columns, 45 beams, 15 to a row. Its windows were placed high in sets of 3 facing each other. All the doorways had rectangular frames. They were in the front part in sets of 3 facing each other. He made a colonnade 50 cubits long and 30 wide. In front of it was a portico, and in front of that were pillars and an overhanging roof. He built the throne hall, the hall of justice, where he was to judge, and he covered it with cedar from floor to ceiling. And the palace in which he was to live, set further back, was similar in design. Solomon also made a palace like this hall for Pharaoh's daughter, whom he had married. Remember, that was the first wife, so she got her own palace. I don't know if it was part of the deal that he made with the Pharaoh that she would get her own palace, or he just liked her the best, or whatever, for whatever reason, she got her own palace. We're not sure about all the other wives, that the rest of the 699 other wives and the 300 concubines, exactly where they stayed. Some of them probably stayed on the premises in the palace, and some of them probably didn't. They couldn't fit them all in there, or even close to that, even though the palaces were huge. Verse 11, above were high-grade stones, cut to size, cedar beams. The great courtyard was surrounded by a wall of 3 courses of dressed stone and 1 course of trimmed cedar beams, as was the inner courtyard of the temple of the Lord with its portico. Now, I Googled the Palace of Solomon, and the results of that were shocking to me. They were very few results, very few renderings of the Palace of Solomon, and they were terrible. I just didn't like any of them. None of them really showed anything that's described here in its magnificence. And again, I think they should at least do this. I don't think this would offend anybody. They should rebuild what they think Solomon's palace looked like based on these specifications, and they're pretty good specifications, by the way, so that we can get a visual of what it looked like. But I wasn't able to find anything that really impressed me or demonstrated how beautiful and magnificent this was. The work on the temple structure was completed in 7 years, but as we said, it took several more years for Hiram and his crew to decorate the interior and construct the furnishings. While they were busy at the temple, Solomon designed and built a palace for himself that was a combination of personal residence, city hall, armory, and official reception center. He wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, I enlarged my works. I built houses for myself. That's in verse 4. When you read this description of the project, you get the impression that it involves several isolated structures, but 1 Kings 9:10 refers to the 2 houses or the 2 buildings, the temple and the palace. And so we might call it a palace complex, but they were probably all connected with a courtyard kind of in the middle. The palace was twice as large as the temple and probably had 2, if not 3 stories to it. It was 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall. It was the same height, interestingly, as the temple. This was 150 by 75, and the temple was 90 by 30. So you see the difference in scale there with width and length. The total structure included 2 porches or colonnades, Solomon's own residence, a residence for his Egyptian wife, and this writer says, and perhaps part of his harem. Again, we don't really know for sure. A throne room, a hall of which was called a hall of justice, and a spacious reception hall, all tied together by a large courtyard set off by walls like those at the temple. We don't have a detailed description to guide us, but it appears that when you approached the building, you came to a smaller porch that served as the main entrance. This led to a larger porch or a colonnade with cedar pillars, which probably served as a waiting room. From there, you moved into the Hall of Pillars, a large assembly hall, on and so on and so forth. Okay. Because of the abundance of these cedar pillars from Lebanon, the structure was known as the Palace of the Forest of Lebanon. The assembly hall was no doubt used for official government occasions. In this hall, Solomon displayed 300 large shields. Now listen to this part. Solomon displayed 300 large shields and 200 smaller shields. That's 500 shields in all made of wood covered in gold. And so he's got 500 shields in there, all covered in gold. So that's a lot of gold. The larger ones used 7.5 pounds of gold each, a total of 1,500 pounds, and the smaller shields 3.5 pounds apiece, making over 1,000 pounds, a total of 2,525 pounds of gold for all 500 shields. Since gold is too soft to provide protection, these shields were not used in battle, of course, but were there to impress visitors. They were taken from the building only when displayed on special ceremonial occasions. So again, a magnificent structure, and certainly worthy of building just to see what it looked like. I don't know what your house looks like, but this is probably nicer. I don't know how many shields that are gold in your house. I don't have any. From the hall, you moved into the throne room, or the hall of justice, where Solomon met with his officers, settled disputes that were referred to him, and gave judgments concerning governmental affairs. It was there that he and his magnificent throne, where he had his magnificent throne that we're going to see described in chapter 10. Solomon's living quarters, and we assume the queen's quarters, were behind this throne room. So there you go. Now, having described his palace, let's look more at the temple. Look in verse 13. Now, I'm going to ask for your patience here, and I may skip some of this if it gets too tedious. I love architecture, but you can only say cedar columns so many times. And so I didn't write it. Just bear with me. King Solomon sent to Tyre and brought Huram, whose mother was a widow from the tribe of Naphtali, and whose father was a man of Tyre and a craftsman in bronze. Huram was highly skilled and experienced in all kinds of bronze work. He came to King Solomon and did all the work assigned to him. He cast 2 bronze pillars, each 18 cubits high and 12 cubits around by line. He also made 2 capitals of cast bronze to set on the tops of the pillars. Each capital was 5 cubits high, and that's the piece that goes at the bottom at the top of the pillars. A network of interwoven chains connected the capitals on top of the pillars, 7 for each capital. He made pomegranates in 2 rows encircling each network to decorate the capitals on top of the pillars. He did the same for each capital. The capitals on top of the pillars and the portico were in the shape of lilies, 4 cubits high. On the capitals of both pillars, above the bowl-shaped part next to the network, there were 200 pomegranates in rows all around. He erected the pillars at the portico of the temple. The pillar to the south, he named the pillars Jachin, and the one to the north, Boaz. How about that? So can you go back to the outside of the temple, the one that showed the pillars? All right, the other one. I think there was another. Was there another one? Yeah, so I do like that. That right there gives you a pretty good idea. That's a good-looking pillar there. And you see they did a cutout, so they chopped the other one so you could see inside the temple. All right, where was our verse 23? He made the sea. What is the sea? That's the basin of cast metal, circular. All right, go to that one too. Circular in shape, measuring 10 cubits from rim to rim and 5 cubits high. It took a line of 30 cubits to measure around it. Below the rim Gourds encircled it, 10 to a cubit. The gourds were cast in 2 rows and one piece with the sea. The sea stood on 12 bulls, 3 facing north, 3 facing west, 3 facing south, and 3 facing east. And so, they did good. They got 3 and 3 on each side. So there you go. The sea rested on top of them, and their hindquarters were toward the center. It was a handbreadth in thickness, and its rim was like the rim of a cup, like a lily blossom. It held 2,000 baths. He also made 10 movable stands of bronze. Each was 4 cubits long, 4 wide, and 3 high. This is how the stands were made. They had side panels attached to uprights. On the panels between the uprights were lions, bulls, and cherubim, and on the uprights as well. Above and below the lions and bulls were wreaths of hammered work. Each stand had 4 bronze wheels and bronze axles, and each had a basin resting on 4 supports cast with wreaths on each side. And you see, that's what those thingies there are, and there's one over there. Verse 36, he engraved cherubim, lions, and palm trees on the surfaces of the supports and on the panels in every available space with wreaths all around. This is the way that he made the 10 stands. They were all cast in the same molds and were identical in size and shape. He then made 10 bronze basins, each holding 40 baths and measuring 4 cubits across, 1 basin to go on each of the 10 stands. He placed 5 of the stands on the south of the temple and 5 on the north. He placed the sea on the south side and the southeast corner of the temple. He also made the basins and shovels and sprinkling bowls. So Huram finished all the work he had undertaken for King Solomon in the temple of the Lord. Whew. The 2 pillars, the 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 2 sets of network decorating the 2 bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 400 pomegranates for the 2 sets of network, 2 rows of pomegranates for each network decorating the bowl-shaped capitals on top of the pillars, the 10 stands with their 10 basins, the sea and the 12 bowls under it, the pots, shovels, and sprinkling bowls. All these objects that Huram made for the king Solomon for the temple of the Lord were of burnished bronze. The king had them cast in clay molds in the plain of the Jordan between Succoth and Zarethan. Solomon left all these things unweighed because there were so many. The weight of the bronze was not determined. Solomon also made all the furnishings that were in the Lord's temple. The golden altar, the golden table, which was the bread of the presence, the lampstands of pure gold, 5 on the right, 5 on the left, in front of the inner sanctuary. So, yeah, you can see them right there on that side. The gold floor work and the lamps and tongs, the pure gold basins, wick trimmers, sprinkling bowls, dishes and censers, and the gold sockets for the doors of the innermost room, the most holy place, and also for the doors of the main hall of the temple. When all the work King Solomon had done for the temple of the Lord was finished, he brought in the things his father David had dedicated, the silver and the gold and the furnishings, and he placed them in the treasuries of the Lord's temple. Amen. All right. So I can say that to say, I don't know if antiquity, there's a description of any ancient structure this detailed. I mean, we could do a lot if we had to reconstruct this. There's a lot of information here. We can't reconstruct it. We can't afford it. There's a lot of gold there. But it is impressive, the detail. It's difficult to calculate the cost of this building in modern currency. It isn't enough just to know the price of the precious metal today, but we also need to know its purchasing power. Then we must calculate what Solomon paid for manpower and materials and try to express it in contemporary equivalents. When you consider that there was gold overlay on the inside walls and floors, the furniture, the doors, and the cherubim, you have no hesitation concluding that this was a very costly building. And yet all this beauty was destroyed, and this wealth was confiscated when the Babylonian army captured Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in 587 BC. Nebuchadnezzar robbed the temple and deported the captives in stages, and eventually his men burned the city and the temple so that they could get their hands on all the gold that was there. How painful it is to realize that Solomon, the man who constructed the temple, was the man who married a multitude of foreign wives who encouraged idolatry in Israel, the very sin that turned the nation away from God and brought upon them the fiery judgment of the Lord and the destruction of the temple. So you see the irony there? All right, that's it. I'm tired. Do you have any questions or comments about this chapter or the previous? Yes. You should paint that, by the way. You're the artist.
I'm thinking, though, that it's like, bearing false, worshiping false idols almost.
Well, it's interesting. So if you're going to go with us, by the way, to Israel, it's too late this time, but I'll take it back in 2 years. You're going to see an amazing thing in Israel. In fact, if you do a tour across Europe, and Europe's an amazing continent just for its history, all the Greek and the Roman influence and all the ancient structures and the building and all the statues, and most of them we don't even have. I think it was Rome, and there's a foot. They have a foot. It's all that survived of the statue was a foot. And the toe, the big toe is this long. I mean, the foot is just massive, and so the statue had to have been just colossal. And so most of it we don't have, but they had statue after statue after statue and idol after idol after idol. Most of the statues were idols of false gods. Against that, you go to Israel, nothing. Nothing. This was the most ornate thing that God ever had them do, by the way, because of their problem with idolatry. And so while there is a lot of decorative things, generally, I think God stuck with things that they didn't worship or wouldn't worship: pomegranates, palm trees. You have to be pretty bad off to be worshiping a pomegranate, although I wouldn't put it past them. But I think the closest would come is the cherubim, but since they never saw them or the Ark of the Covenant, only the high priest, and only once a year. So, of the millions of Israelites, they never saw that. If they'd opened up the curtain and allowed tours, it wouldn't have been a month before they were worshiping those as idols, definitely. But today, with that gone, we look back at the we look back at the architectural remnants, and we look at all like if you go to Pompeii, it's fantastic. You look at all the statues and all the things, and you piece it all together, the coins, and look at their gods on the coins, and you have all this visual iconography that you can recreate or rebuild that their society and what they saw. And we don't have that in Israel because they wouldn't have any graven idols before them. And I told you there was one exception, and that there may be a few exceptions in the museum, but if you go to Capernaum, there's a stone that has a sculpture of a cart, and some think that this is the Ark of the Covenant sitting on the cart, and some think it's like a buggy thing. It's hard to tell from the picture, but it's unusual because it is a Jewish carving of a Jewish item, and it's just so rare anywhere in Israel to have that because of that prohibition. Yeah. But it also goes to show that if you want to find something to worship, you'll find something because, they put a stick in the ground and worship. They weren't too picky. All right, any other questions or comments? Yes? Oh, yeah. Well, thanks for listening to me read it all. But again, it does give you a bird's eye view. It gives you a feel for just the complexity of this structure. All right, that ends our Bible study time for tonight. We'll take up there next week.